The most agonizing punishment a person can endure happens entirely inside the mind. Long before a cell door ever slams shut, a guilty conscience constructs its own walls, turning a person's thoughts into a high-security prison where there is no possibility of escape. In 1860s St. Petersburg, a former student named Rodion Raskolnikov lives in a state of absolute isolation. His room is a tiny, suffocating garret under the roof of a 5-story house, a space more like a cupboard than a bedroom. Crushed by poverty and debt, he spends his days lying in the dark, spinning a dangerous idea that he believes will solve all his problems. He develops a strict mathematical hypothesis about human value. This diagram represents his worldview, a massive base of ordinary people whose only purpose is to reproduce, and at the very top, a single extraordinary individual. Raskolnikov convinces himself that these great men, people like Napoleon, possess a natural right to overstep the law and shed blood if it serves a higher purpose. He believes this elevated status makes him free, but by placing himself above the rest of humanity, he cuts himself off from human empathy. His own intellectual superiority complex builds the walls of a psychological cage. To prove he belongs at the top of that pyramid, Raskolnikov targets a ruthless old pawnbroker. He sneaks into her dim, cramped apartment and murders her with an axe, intending to steal her cash to fund his future and prove his theory. But his cold, calculated equation fails to account for human unpredictability. The pawnbroker's younger sister, Lisaveta, a timid, innocent woman, walks into the apartment in the middle of the act. Panic takes over, and Raskolnikov is forced to murder her as well to cover his tracks. He barely manages to slip out unseen, burying the stolen goods under a rock in a nearby courtyard, without even counting the money. Almost immediately, his body begins to revolt. The adrenaline evaporates, leaving him violently ill and fading in and out of a feverish delirium in his closet-sized room. The police have no suspects and no physical evidence tying him to the scene. But the visceral reality of the blood on his hands begins to corrode his logic. He finds himself trapped in a psychological pressure cooker, where his abstract theories no longer feel like armor, but like a lead weight dragging him toward a breakdown. Look at this photograph of a historic St. Petersburg thoroughfare. The city outside his door is dense, loud, and suffocatingly hot. Raskolnikov wanders these crowded streets, constantly looking over his shoulder. Every casual glance from a stranger feels like an accusation. This paranoia attracts the attention of the lead investigator, Porfiry Petrovich. Porfiry understands the mechanics of psychology, who looks past physical clues to study behavior. He immediately suspects the erratic former student, but he knows he lacks the physical evidence needed to make an arrest. Instead of interrogating him directly, Porfiry traps Raskolnikov in casual, twisting conversations. He brings up an old academic article Raskolnikov wrote about the extraordinary man, treating it like a friendly intellectual debate to see if the student will slip up and defend the logic of his own crime. Porfiry understands the mechanics of guilt. He knows that an isolated mind, burdened by a terrible secret, cannot bear its own weight indefinitely.
If he simply gives Raskolnikov enough rope, the young man's fracturing sanity will eventually do the police's work for them. The pressure multiplies when Raskolnikov's mother and his fiercely loyal sister, Dunya, arrive in the city. They haven't seen him in years, and they are horrified by the pale, raving, hostile stranger they find living in a state of absolute squalor. He learns that Dunya is about to marry a wealthy, arrogant lawyer named Luzhin. It is a loveless arrangement, a sacrifice Dunya is making entirely to pull their family out of poverty and pay for Raskolnikov's education. Raskolnikov viciously sabotages the engagement, driving Luzhin away. But protecting his sister brings him no relief. Looking at his family's devotion, he realizes that by committing murder, he has destroyed his moral right to be part of their lives. He can't even embrace his mother without feeling like a monster. Seeking out someone as ruined as himself, he turns to Sonia. She is a frail young woman, often wearing a distinct green family shawl, who was forced into prostitution to keep her stepmother and young siblings from starving to death. They are mirror images of transgression. Raskolnikov broke the rules to elevate himself, while Sonia broke herself to save others. Confronted by her quiet endurance, his arrogant theory begins to fail. He sees that her selfless suffering requires true strength, while his intellectual violence was an act of cowardice. The walls close in completely with the arrival of Svidrigailov. He is a predator who has ruined multiple lives without a shred of remorse. And worst of all, he happens to rent the room right next to Sonia's, silently eavesdropping as Raskolnikov finally breaks down and confesses the murder to her. Svidrigailov represents the terrifying endpoint of Raskolnikov's extraordinary man theory, a life devoid of all morality. He is a man who has successfully stepped over every boundary, only to find that life without limits is a hollow, agonizing void. When Svidrigailov finally puts a revolver to his head, it signals the total bankruptcy of a life lived purely for the self. For Raskolnikov, learning of this final act of despair is a warning. He is looking at the only logical conclusion to his own intellectual path. The pressure cooker can hold no more. Boxed in by Detective Porfiry's logic, and moved by Sonia's demand that he go to the crossroads and kiss the earth he defiled, Raskolnikov finally yields. He walks through the crowded city one last time, enters the police station, and confesses that it was he who killed the pawnbroker and her sister. In that single moment, the unbearable, crushing weight of his intellectual arrogance is dropped. He is sentenced to 8 years of hard labor in Siberia. Yet, enduring the physical misery of the prison barracks with Sonia by his side, something remarkable happens. Stripped of his theories and his pride, his mind finds peace. Looking at this portrait of Fyodor Dostoevsky, the warning he left us is clear. The pure, rational intellect, when divorced from morality, is a cold and isolating trap. We do not find our humanity by rising above the crowd, but by accepting our shared struggles and our deep, unbreakable connections to one another.